Today's episode of Between the Covers is brought to you by World Poetry. World Poetry is a non-profit publisher of poetry and translation, founded in 2017 and based in New York City. World Poetry publishes from a broad range of languages and traditions, bringing the work of modern masters, emerging voices, and pioneering innovators from around the world to English language readers in affordable, high-quality trade editions. Recent authors have included the Swiss surrealist and visual artist Marit Oppenheim, legendary French symbolist poet Paul Verlaine, and Zuzana Jinchenka, a visionary Polish-Ukrainian Jewish poet of the interwar period, as well as authors from Chile, Germany, Mexico, Palestine, and beyond. This month, World Poetry is publishing translations from French, Hindi, and Indonesian, including the first English language publications of Leela Darjaguri and Afzal Malna. For more information and to subscribe to their newsletter, you can visit worldpoetrybooks.com or find them on Instagram at World Poetry Books or on X, formerly known as Twitter, at World Poetry Book. Today's episode is also brought to you by Fiona Warwick's transformative novel, The Skunks. Following Isabel as she returns to her hometown after graduating from college, this coming-of-age story ponders the complexities of crushes, desire, friendship, and modern life, all a backdrop to Isabel's preoccupation with 3 baby skunks. Says Annie Hartnett, The Skunks is a gleaming, zany little gem, a novel that perfectly captures the weirdness of being young and just out of college and not sure what comes next. Adds Allegra Hyde, this is a novel that asks big questions of friendship, romantic firsts, and finding one's way in the world. The Skunks is out now from Tin House. Today is an exciting day for me because I've had a long-standing interest in having Joyelle McSweeney on the show, and for many different reasons. Her poetry, her criticism, the way she performs, the crucial space her and her partner Johannes Göransson hold with regards to poetics and aesthetics and translation in the poetry world, how alive her poetry is in spite of, or perhaps because of, its deep engagement with death, personal and global, personal catastrophe and environmental calamity, and more. So I was extra delighted by what Joyelle has contributed to the bonus audio archive. At one point early in the conversation today, I bring up her libretto Pistorius Rex, which was inspired by the murder trial of the double amputee Olympic athlete Oscar Pistorius, a libretto of which only excerpts have been published. And Joyelle not only decided to contribute a nearly 20-minute performance from it, but did so by performing on video, the first ever video contribution. So you can see her gestures, gesticulations, and facial expressions, as well as the strange artificial background she used, the same one I was looking at as we talked today for the main conversation. This joins many other contributions by great performance artist poets. For instance, C.A. Conrad performing their piece, Memories of Why I Stopped Being a Man, which was written as part of the 50th anniversary celebration of Ursula K. Le Guin's Left Hand of Darkness, where each of the 3 parts begins with a Le Guin quote, then autobiographical prose by Conrad, and then a poem. But also a late-night whispered reading by Banu Kapil, 2 performed poems by Douglas Kearney, and Johanna Hedva's performance, The Saddest Thing of All is When a Lone Astronaut Falls in Her Suit, Who is There to Help Her Up, which was created just for us, from moans, groans, screams, and written text, recorded city to city while they were on tour, and performed alongside and within the sounds of the universe itself, the sonifications of a black hole or field recordings of the aurora borealis. The bonus audio is only one possible benefit of joining the Between the Covers community as a listener supporter. Every supporter gets the resources corresponding to each episode sent to them of what I discovered while preparing or what I referenced during the conversation, where to go after you're done listening. Every listener supporter can join our brainstorm of future guests. And then there are everything from rare collectibles from Karen Joy Fowler to Ray Armentrout to the Tin House Early Reader subscription. You can find out about all of this and much more at patreon.com/betweenthecovers. And now for today's conversation with Joyelle McSweeney. Good morning and welcome to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's guest, poet, playwright, novelist, translator, publisher, editor, and critic, Joyelle McSweeney, has a BA in English from Harvard University, an MPhil in English Studies from Oxford, and an MFA in poetry from the Iowa Writers Workshop. And she's a professor of English at the University of Notre Dame. With Johannes Joransson, she co-edits the International Press Action Books, who have published everyone from Don Miche and Kim Hai-soon to Raul Zarita and Daniel Berzutsky, to past Between the Covers guest Valerie Mayer-Caso. McSweeney was guest editor with Carmen Maria Machado of Best American Experimental Writing 2020 and co-translated with Don Miche several of the pieces in Yi Song's selected works. She's one of our great contemporary critics, and her book, The Necropastoral, Poetry, Media, Occults, is a vital work of literary and eco-criticism. In 2022, McSweeney was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship and recognized with the Arts and Letters Award in Literature from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. She's the author of 10 books of poetry, drama, and prose, including The Red Bird, which inaugurated the Fence Modern Poets series in 2001, and her verse play, Dead Youth or the Leaks, which inaugurated the Leslie Scalapino Prize for Innovative Women Performance Artists in 2014. She's the author, among many other things, of the novels Nyland, the Sarcographer, and Flet, and most recently the 2020 poetry collection Toxicon and Arachne, a finalist for the Kingsley Tufts Award, and for which she was awarded the Shelley Memorial Prize by the Poetry Society of America, whose past winners include Elizabeth Bishop, E. Cummings, Gwendolyn Brooks, Lucille Clifton, and Bernadette Mayer. Publishers Weekly, in its starred review, said of Toxicon and Arachne, formally brilliant, emotionally heartbreaking, and considerably terrifying, this is a stunning work from one of poetry's most versatile experimentalists. Dan Chasen at The New Yorker adds, the power of McSweeney's work cannot be separated from its association with forms of oracle and soothsaying, and so it is uncanny that it should arrive in the middle of a global pandemic. The kamikaze fantasy arises, like everything in this frightening and brilliant book, not from a pleasant brainstorm, but from the animal reflexes of the brain stem. The defeat is total, a rout, a blowout. Joyelle McSweeney is here today to talk about her next book, her follow-up to Toxicon and Arachne, her latest poetry collection, Death Styles. The New York Times Book Review says of Death Styles, after McSweeney's infant daughter died, she found herself unable to write for 2 years. She made her way back via the torrent of poems in this collection. The result is like a volcano, spewing details of pop culture and regular life amid waves of grief and perseverance. And David Wu for LitHub adds, if to style from stylus a stake or pale-pointed instrument for writing is to impale a thought with one's pen. Joyelle McSweeney's new book styles the aftermath of an infant daughter's death as anguished, living consciousness pinned and vivisected, still squirming onto the pages of an outre thought diary, a periphery perforated by absurdity and calamity like funeral games performed for a slain infant, she says, alluding to Euripides. In Destal's, style may be, like the progression of a life, something narrow and transitory, what Schopenhauer termed the physiognomy of the mind, the flickers of an expressive face suggesting a vaster interiority, the permanent tear in a surviving mother's eye, the morbid yet healing grin, the frail gaze ahead. Welcome to Between the Covers, Joyelle McSweeney.
Thank you for making me feel so welcome. That is a really expansive and slightly terrifying and really vital introduction. Thank you.
So before we talk about Destal's in particular, I wanted to spend a little time with your aesthetics and poetics that long predate this new book. 9 years ago at Harvard, at an event called In Extremis on Poetry, Subversion, and Violence, the literary critic and poet Stephanie Burt interviewed both you and your partner and co-editor at Action Books, poet and translator Johannes Göransson, someone I hope to also someday have on the show. I was charmed by Stephanie's introduction, both what she said and how she delivered it, how even though your writing and Johannes's writing is very different in mode and style, and often in theme and content, that she felt like your work not only spoke to each other's, but toward similar questions around poetry. She opens up by talking about how she has followed your work in the world as well as the people you've published, and equally the arguments you've been having with others in the literary world, with fascination, occasionally appalled, but always interested. She said that when she read you together, that you both raised questions about extremes, about where and when we want our poetry to violate boundaries of decency and propriety and expectation, and what you gain and what you lose by having blood all over the page, and how these are not just questions in your own work, but in your work as critics and your work within your publishing universe, where Stephanie quotes an Action Books statement, which I'll read a little more of than she did at the time. Action Books believes in historical avant-gardes, an unknowable, discontemporary, discontinuous, occultly continuous, anachronistic avant-gardes. Art, genre, voice, prophecy, theatricality, materials, the bodies, foreign tongues and other foreign objects and substances, if taken internally, may break apart societal forms. In an emergency, break form. And Stephanie continues by talking about your shared aesthetic of excess, of discomfort, of the abject, of taking not a scalpel but a bazooka to things as they are. And I bring this up also because there's a certain exuberance and delight to the way she delivers her introduction that I've also noted in other people introducing you over the years, as if your own mode of being, of excess and exuberance, is contagious or infectious, and that people discover a certain joy in being perhaps possessed by it as a result. In a more recent interview at EcoTheo, where they ask you if you have any words of wisdom or advice for those attempting to resist the mundane, you say, "Well, the problem is this world. The solution must be underworlds, otherworlds, anti-worlds, paraworlds, and afterworlds, which may be foreworlds. Luckily, there's such a preponderance of artists, poets, activists, and dreamers, alive, not yet conceived, and posthumous, working in anachronistic confluence, fed by so many streams of speculation and inheritance, to manifest a multiverse. For my part, I am a devout decadent, so I firmly believe in anachronism, inversion, reversals, paradox, metaphor, error, hyperdiction, ornament, odes, frank ocean, the sublime, immodesty, immoderateness, and going all the way. My aim is to exhaust my star." Like I imagine Stephanie and the other introducers felt, I feel in my body a certain type of joy or feeling a certain type of aliveness reading your words back to you, as if your mode has spilled into me. Borrowing a phrase from your press, action books, art, and other fluids. Talk to us about art as a fluid, perhaps as a fluid with transmissible substances, or about what hyperdiction is, or anything else that this might inspire in you to talk about.
Well, I think that is a pretty comprehensive mapping of the ways that I've been thinking about art for a really long time, for decades. I had a very canonical poetry education, the most canonical because it started in my high school, where I started out by learning Latin. And it just so happened it's public high school, but they offered Latin. This was in the golden age of the SATs when they still had Latin on the books. This was supposedly going to help you with the SATs. So I got to take Latin. And when you take Latin, you get to read poetry. You have to. You translate poetry. They just like give you some vocab and then set you right up with the Aeneid or with Catullus or with Horace. And the amazing part about that for me meant that I got to study poetry in depth. Poetry mattered. I don't think there was any other part of that curriculum, including AP English or what have you, that included poetry, certainly not in that level of depth, where you were required to think about how it was made, its sonics, its beats, its metaphors, its indulgences, its trips to the underworld. It's being covered in blood, being noticed by the gods, going out of your way to get the gods noticed, bringing your complaints right to the gods. Hell yeah. That's how big poetry can be. And because in a way I had such a canonical education, I also had a huge model of what poetry should be. And then I did go to Harvard, as you mentioned, and I went in another golden age, I suppose, because Helen Wendler was very much there. And so poetry was right at the center of the curriculum again. It was considered one of the most important things that you could train your vision on. And she marched us right through her canon in like these medium-sized lecture courses of what American poetry was to her. And that meant, we just read a ton of 20th century American poetry. And armed with this kind of double canon, this classical canon, and then this like very much like American grain canon, I went off to Oxford and added in Irish modernism, just to kind of rumple things a bit. And then that was the model of poetry that I had, that my brain was steeped in. And then an interesting thing happened. I got my MFA. I fell in with a guy called Johannes Janssen. And suddenly translation was opened up to me. And just that beginning of translation, just that beginning of the idea that other contemporary poets had totally separate reference points, lineages, urgencies, reasons for making art, made me take a second glance at everything I had read and recontextualize everything I had read in this kind of spangled war aegis that was as big as the cosmos itself, that involved all the fighting and tussling of the gods, all the fighting and tussling of all the chemicals and irons and metals and things that were thrown out by the Big Bang, all of it rummaging together in the firmaments. And suddenly that was as big as poetry was. And that was as full of conflict and refulgence and discovery and ecstasies and theophanies and catabases and huge struggles. All of these things were poetry. After that, there was really no going back. And for the last few decades, basically all the poetry I've had the good luck to encounter, I have just made room for in this cosmology. And it is a poetry that's like alive and on fire at all times and absolutely in crisis and coming from crisis and casting out unexpected spectacles and effulgences.
Well, thinking of art and other fluids, I think of the libretto Pistorius Rex you were working on at the time of your interview with Stephanie, your interest in this athlete, Paralympic champion and the first double leg amputee participant to win a world track medal, someone with supreme control over his body, and how after he murdered his girlfriend at trial, how he lost all control over it, not just tears and mucus, but multiple episodes of vomiting during the proceedings. This might seem like a weird preface to wanting to spend a moment with the notion of the necropastoral, but in your book of eco-criticism, you talk about the manifestation of the infectious anxiety and contagion being occultly present in the hygienic borders of the classical pastoral, that we shouldn't forget that the premier celebrity resident of Arcadia is death. You say, quote, "The charnel fields of the necropastoral entail a decomposing mucoid substance that hosts strange meetings. The living and the dead, the not quite living and the not quite dead, the wounded, the bleeding, the moan, the worm, death, the poet. Chlorine gas and petroleum can meet, eat, shit, interpenetrate, shred and shed, goo, make apertures, struggle with each other, shove their faces in and through each other's mouths or chest walls, generating more slime, puke, language, and good charnel and necrotizing material, i.e. art, and never arrive at a final configuration. Once the contemporary poet slips out of the carefully delineated and Cartesian axes of historical time and national space to enter in this necropastoral, art's residue can never be removed." It feels important to bring this up as I feel like this is an important through line in your work. And I guess I'd love to hear more about, or have you expand a little bit more on the necropastoral, especially because you, like, as I read this back to you now, after hearing your last answer, this moving from the Cartesian axes of historical time also seems to mimic what you're describing around how you begin in the most canonical and sort of normatively recognizable realm of poetry. And what I just read back as another way to conceive of art feels like an entirely different mode or relationship to it.
Yes, I think in some ways this goes back to your original point about energy and the release of energy, even in the most decadent precincts or the things that are most often perjurated or seen as very negative in both American culture and like American aesthetics, like mold and bugs and certainly viruses, graves, wastelands, even very unfashionable places, such as where I live in northwestern Indiana and the post-industrial Rust Belt. And I do think that living here in the Rust Belt has been foundational for rethinking a model of art that comes from some place that is very low down, that is not seen as valuable, beautiful, hygienic, or even particularly safe on an environmental level. And wondering, what does a map of the cosmos look like from here? What does a map of the cosmos look like if you're starting out from South Bend, Indiana? And it looks like the Necropastoral. It looks like a place where both the high and the low are melted down, touch, interwoven with each other, in communication with each other, things from different periods, things in different languages, different models, and that this is a place of lawless exchange, like the grave itself. And it's also, in a way, true to my experience of poetry, that things from different periods suddenly speak very loudly and directly to me one day, along with whatever earworm is in my head that day, some New Order hook and some fragment of Sappho and some little bit of Lowell that's hanging around and some little image from Kim Hae-sun. Suddenly those four things are in some kind of clot of my brain, and I decide to go live there for a while. And that's where the enjoyment and the threat of poetry lives and comes from. So attaching the word necro to pastoral allow me to kind of name and recognize a kind of activity and a kind of potentiality that comes when we reverse the telescope and look the other way. And I am using an intentionally Looney Tunes type imagery there of you reverse your telescope and you see some cartoonishly small thing that suddenly seems very big, a flea walking across a hair, and you take it to be the equator, that kind of thing from Looney Tunes. That's another very important lens of all of this for me. A real American lunatic, war-laden, probably 20th century way of looking at the world and all of its exaltations and disappointments and dismays.
You write a lot about prophecy, whether Rimbaud's idea of the poet becoming a seer through the derangement of the senses, or your reference to the leaves spilling out of the mouth of the Sibyl's cave in the afterword to Death Styles. And many people found the arrival of Toxicon and Arachne during the worst of the pandemic as uncannily prescient, since it was written before the pandemic and yet speaks to it. Eventually, I want to talk about how Death Styles does and doesn't relate to the book before it, given that they both engage with the death of your daughter. But for now, as a preface to hearing the opening poem of Death Styles, I wanted to mention the ways your last book was prophetic. Dan Chasen in The New Yorker again said, Toxicon and Arachne is actually two books, bound as one and yoked together by disaster. In Toxicon, written while carrying her third child, McSweeney imagines her body as a poisonous, dangerous host, a nest of scum or a jet engine with a stork torso caught inside it. The world that awaits the child is equally extravagantly lethal. Factory hens carry their viral load, while the Zika mosquito dips its improbable proboscis into the human layer and vomits an inky toxin. And you say in your essay, How I Became a Prophetess, my first act of prophecy was to predict my own child's death. Uncannily, in the years and months leading up to her ill-starred birth, I had written a book called Toxicon, obsessed with the themes of toxins, contamination, gestation, mutation, a smashed delivery suite, and a pulseless fontanelle. Arachne's birth converted Toxicon from a book of obsessions into one of prophecies, and me into a prophetess. So Death Styles opens again with Arachne, and I was hoping we could hear the opening poem to Death Styles.
I'd be delighted to read this poem because it is a big poem. It's set in South Bend. It involves one of my antagonists, Dawn, both the Dawn and the goddess Dawn, and Dawn as a pretty blonde in the sky. So I'm very pleased to take her on with this first poem. Okay, so this is the Death Style for August 11th, 2020. And when I was writing these, they're all named for the style inspiration that kicked the poem off. So my style inspo for this poem is a skunk. 8/11/20, a skunk. It's dawn, and I'm out in the gray-green light with the dog. Dawn is also a style. Black bands and a Marimekko robe, the most expensive thing I own. I cinch it with a slash and feel glamorous. The leash is also a style. The dog in her spotted sheath is also a style. I cross the field beside the tennis courts where the high school boys meet for trust exercises, laced in each other's arms before the net. Everything is laced together, and nothing drains away. Nothing drains away. But does it have to be this beautiful? Matter stops the storm drain. Wet grass knots at my feet. I hate it. No, I like it. No, I like it as I kick my way to the sidewalk. Sneakers soaked above their trademark rubber soles. A loneliness American as a kick in the teeth. Weeds disapprove of this remark and lean away. The dog goes along reading her novel, some other creature's mark or waste. I remember one early morning where a skunk was crossing a large groomed lawn, shielding his head with his spread tail, also large, groomed, and dazzling, as any canopy raised to shield a crown or cargo bay in ancient Egypt or in space by astronauts, their tools, their formal pace. How like a coin the skunk turns on his edge to show his profile. Is it my slingshot or my bird brain, my predator or my prey, my lunar or my earthly style that right now freezes me in place? The radio detective says, aye, it's a planet of killers. And I'm another, and the skunk is another improbable king, masking a killer, nomen, an antonym, or vice versa. The skunk made a diamond of the lawn with his diagonal path. My husband wanted to watch. I wanted to leave, afraid to be sprayed, but really afraid of his magnificent shape, magnificently self-contained, that can stand on its head on the equator like an egg, or split its own brain with its own cicators in two equal hemispheres and execute any move under that moon, walk, sock of white, glove of white, sidewalk that lights. All times are noon. I want to live in that micro regime which pulls the watch face all around itself, black eye that winks back from the center of the watch where the hand should be attached, but the hands are gone. The watch face is blank. The style points exactly to itself, shoves both Mickey Mouse gloves in its mouth. It never leaves home, but takes any long spear of shadow directly into the eye and swallows it up to stop it traveling. No time passes, but you can stay forever if you agree to block out your eyes. Go anaerobic and give everything up. A mesh and two drains, a distended abdomen, a nudge and a wink, a little half grin, and a little flexing arm, all signs of infant seizure, but only in one picture can you see her mouth make that shape that makes me shake. I've deleted that photo anyway. I've deleted the photon, shoved it right back up the gut of the cosmos that made it, and sent it shooting out across the universe, going the wrong way. You're going the wrong way. What? How do you know where we're going? I mouth the dialogue. I put my thumb in my mouth to mime the drinking I will do at 5 o'clock on the dot, at the spot, in the center of the clock. Face, watch face, sundial style. We put the gel in her hair for the EEG, then decided to scrap the test, so she died with her black hair gunky. I hate that. Where were we when? I hate that. Where were we when I don't hold her because I don't want to hurt her while she dies, or after because she feels so much more dead and heavier? Anyway, where were we when we watched the skunk cross that diamond, when he turned in profile and made a procession of himself, entailed a retinue, raised his $1,000,000 solar shade, and shot himself out of all this trouble? All the gauges shake and gag as he points to the stands, hits a grand slam, and rides the diamond right up into the banks of light above the stadium, and then beyond. So bright, the camera cannot follow him. Up there, where we could hold our breath and go anaerobic, but are dismayed to be denied entry to the tomb. Our mortal bloodstreams flood with waste, the brain alarms sound, and all the green numbers roll back in their heads. We're forced to take a breath, and I would take any accelerant or suppressant, slick down my pulse like an infant's cowlick, run my heart down like a medieval town clock, a stuck, gory orgy of moral urges. There, the maiden studies her reflection in the apple. The miller stops beating his wheat. The bird seeks to dislodge the song from its throat, or else whack my heart off till it beats so hard it shakes loose from the cage and flees. The red stained drain, cool tile, and golden hook where I hang myself up like a hotel robe and anaerobe. Back to where we were when we stopped at the sight of the skunk before the green that rose and sharpened our sight on that diamond.
Been listening to Joyelle McSweeney read from Death Styles. I feel like we should just end here and just be in our feelings about it. But before we talk about the specifics of Death Styles as a book, maybe we could spend a moment with how you see this as an extension of or a departure from Toxicon and Arachne as a book.
Well, one thing I'll say is, as you alluded to in the preface, that it's a real departure, because when I finished writing the last poem in Arachne, the story goes, I had written Toxicon, and that is the book that I sent to Nightboat and that they were excited to publish. And I was rushing and rushing to finish it because the baby was going to be born. And then the baby was born, and she was born with an unexpected birth defect, and she lived just 13 days. So this happened in September and October. And then that spring, when spring returned and the baby did not return, I was full with fury, anger at spring. And I wrote this second book, Arachne, just in a torrent of anger. Anger at spring, anger at poetry, anger at myself, of course, anger at everything that led to the loss of this child, including like the Big Bang, anger at everything. Nothing was exempt. But when I wrote the last poem in Arachne, I was so angry at myself, I could not go on. And I slammed my laptop shut. And I said, that's it, no more poetry for you. And it was really kind of an act of self-harm as well. And like many poets' curses, this one held. I could not write again. Even when, a year passed, things started to get a little bit better. Maybe I could have written, but I couldn't write at all because I had cursed my poetry away. So more time passed, and I realized I was not going to survive unless I found a way to also survive with poetry. So I needed to come up with some way to survive, and I needed to come up with some way to write poetry. And they turned out to be the same way, which was the following. I set myself these 3 rules. I was going to write every day. I was going to accept any inspiration that came to me, no matter how peripheral or accidental, like the skunk, for example, or later it's Leonard Cohen, and frequently it's River Phoenix. Any kind of person, animal, image, being that walked through my brain became my companion for that poem and my sort of style icon for that poem. And the 3rd rule was I had to write until I had totally exhausted that topic. With those 3 rules in mind, I just started writing again. And that is the Death Styles.
Do you have an idea why you landed on those 3 constraints in particular?
Well, they are the simplest rules of all. I mean, something that you would easily say to a friend or student, write every day. Something I frequently have to remind myself even is don't edit before there's text there to edit. Like, don't edit your thoughts before they happen, or the line before it's written down, right? So I think for me, I just had to make it conscious again. I had to make it temporal. It produced some writing that is unlike anything I'd written in my career. Like these are very lengthy, legato kind of poems, In some ways, they do seem of a piece with their the variousness of the terrain that they cover. That is just my brain, I think. But I think that the phrasal progress, phrase by phrase by phrase by phrase, you can sort of see that this was a kind of getting through the day.
Well, we have a question for you from another, one that takes a general curiosity I had earlier today and asks it more specifically about how it's embodied in this particular book, Death Styles. And I think of this question in relation to how you say in the afterword that these poems were written largely in your Rust Belt backyard's narrow lot, braced by chain link and weeds. So Ryan Ruby and you are 2 of my favorite critics. Your recent review of Fatty Judah's new book was revelatory. Your review of Monica Youn's From, and perhaps most notably your writings on Douglas Kearney, which were essential for me in preparing to talk with him. And in a similar way, Ryan Ruby's writings on Rosemary Waldrop were essential for me in talking to Waldrop. Ryan is a writer and translator and is the author of the upcoming book Context Collapse, which is a critical essay in verse, or a mock academic verse essay that uncovers the secret history of poetry, of which Dami Che says, Ryan Ruby has written a daring kind of essay. The verse text and verse footnotes conflate and flail, destabilizing and stylizing one another like conjoined twins. So here's a question for you from Ryan.
Hello, Joyelle. My first encounter with your work was the Necropastoral, Poetry, Media, Occults, an absolutely transformative work of criticism for me and my understanding of poetry. In it, you describe, among other things, the way poetry is a medium and the way it interacts with media, with a long consideration of a particular kind of contaminated and decaying landscape as a primal scene for poesis. So I wonder if you could tell us a little more about the necropastoral spaces of death styles, from the alpha poem, A Skunk, in which you write, I crossed the field beside the tennis courts where the high school boys meet for trust exercises. Wet grass knots at my feet. I hate it. No, I like it. No, I like it as I kick my way to the sidewalk, sneakers soaked above their trademarked rubber soles, a loneliness American as a kick in the teeth. To the Omega poem, Agony in the Garden, which is bookended by an image of raw sewage running down to Coney Island Creek in New York.
Well, first of all, I'm just so delighted to hear these incredibly kind remarks from Ryan, and also to think about how he's linking these two poems is just putting a whole total smile on my face, because yes, everything touches. I mean, as that poem I just read says, everything is laced together and nothing drains away. Nothing drains away. As I was reading this poem right now, I was laughing because I forgot that I had quoted dialogue from the John Candy film Planes, Trains, and Automobiles in this big, like, monumental poem that I think of as being very visionary and very massive. I forgot that I had written in this like gag dialogue that is an earworm from my youth. I'm bringing this up now both to laugh a bit at myself, but also to speak to what Ryan's talking about, which is that, I mean, we have this very immediate experience of like walking in wet grass through your sneakers, feeling it come in, and that shock of coldness, and looking down and seeing the white tip of sneakers like teeth, and the American obsession with white teeth, and all those things coming together. What starts with a very bodily and even what passes for natural experience in a liminal space becomes this kind of site of interconnection that laces everything together. And in the poem at the end of the book that Ryan is talking about, that poem began because I did see a tweet, which was from New York City's combined sewers account. The tweet was, raw sewage runs down to Coney Island Creek. And the rhythm of that tweet just captivated me and set off this whole poem, which is itself a kind of orbital. It moves in a whole circle away and back to that tweet. So I guess to speak to Ryan's question, there's this way that language itself and the media by which language is delivered into the ear and sticks around in the neural foci of brain matter, it touches everything, and it's laced together. And there stops being a distinction between having this experience of being out in wet grass in the dawn and seeing a tweet and feeling the kind of flow and jolt of neural activity that leaps off the tweet. Like, these things are all linked together. And to the extent that, as I just sort of remarked, like, I even think of my brain as working this way, as being this kind of wet and spongy, kind of fossy, kind of marshlands, wetlands place where it's kind of wrecked and it's kind of contaminated and it's kind of smelly, and then there's interesting things happening there. I think of my brain anatomy, and especially my hearing anatomy, as being like that.
Well, later I want to talk to you about your hearing anatomy, but I want to spend a moment with the second half of the title. First I think about how you just mentioned bringing together necro and pastoral, but here you're bringing together death and styles. So I wanted to talk about styles. My impression reading Toxicon and Arachne and then Death Styles is that the Arachne section of your last book and most of Death Styles feel more prosy or more narrative than either Toxicon or the section that ends Death Styles that's bookended by the sewage quote, Agony in the Garden. And I wondered both if you felt that were true and also how you relate this in some way, if you do, to writing about the death of a child or about trauma in any way, versus Toxicon, which is written while you're pregnant, or Agony in the Garden, written in dedication to a living son.
Yes, that poem, Agony in the Garden, is sitting up with an infant and having those circular insomniac thoughts of infant care.
Yeah. And I'd also like to hear more about your philosophy on style in general. In your Nightboat interview, you talk about how style is often viewed as something superficial, but that paired with the word death, it, quote, actually opens up this flexing, vertiginous quasi-depth, which in turn makes me think of the seam through which Persephone falls into the depths of Hades with her hands full of flowers. This chain of flexing, now flat, now deep images, all touching at a seam, opened up my pondering. The phrase death styles seemed to mark the seam between life and death. The metaphor of a seam conjures fashion, mourning, dress, and an ambivalence about survival, such a taboo in American literary and grief therapy culture. I think it's very American to see style as somehow separate from and secondary to survival, resistance, politics, etc. Reading Dolores Dorante's Estilo, translated by Jen Hoffer, immediately disabused me of this provincialism. Style is survival, and survival may itself be posthumous. It may be what survives the individual. It might be what plants have, old ladies, communities, sundials. Style is not a what, but a way to dress, to move, to signal, to sing, to gesture, to speak, to refuse to speak, to live and to die, to show and to hide, and to survive. And you echo this in your Lit Hub essay, Style After Survival, on Writing After Death, where you say, style is the robe in which we wrap ourselves so we can stay on our feet. Style is gleaming shears to cut the unbearably lovely fabric of the sky. Style is the gust and the hush. With style we bear the glare of the duck, go sideways like the skunk, glide on the thinnest of skeins to the next hour, the next day. Style is a recognition of things which are like us and which we would like to be like. In this sense, style is simulacra, the copy, the double, that allows art to be made, that is art, both a display and self-encryption that allows us to survive life's plot. So talk to us more about style, the styles in Death Styles in specific perhaps, and or your thoughts about the style of Toxicon versus the style of Arachne and the style of Death Styles. In terms of style?
My work, maybe up to Arachne, frenetically concerned with diction and sound, frenetically confident that just putting words together based on sound would release light, and that light would be an instructive, powerful, possibly annihilating, certainly transmogrifying light, that light of recognition, dismay, ecstasy, all happening in basically what sound can do, the instinct of sound. And I think that the electricness of my work up until the book Arachne, whether it was verse plays, lyric prose, even the Necropastoral, I mean, that vision came about from the word first, the word Necropastoral. The word necropastoral appeared to me, and I was like, what could this mean? What is the prefix necro doing to the pastoral? What is it revealing? What is it insisting on? What kind of temporal drag does it create in that neologism? I was so willing to learn from language and to be kind of in its thrall and let it move through me. That I could make all these different models of the world that way. Thrilling to me. I always felt I was writing about the world. I did not feel like I was writing in some Parnassian place that had nothing to do with the world. I felt like all this language, this English that carried its own imperial past, present, and future. It carried Greek and Roman imperial histories, all kinds of things like that. I also have a very, like I've mentioned Looney Tunes before. I feel like that's foundational for me for thinking about automatopoiesis and violence and pauses and stunts and stutters and all kinds of things. So actually and even beats, dramatic beats from Looney Tunes. So I did not think my work was apart from the world. I just thought it was moving in the world and making models of it and hurling those models out and that kind of thing. And then, and then my baby died. And there's like a no undoing it. I was beset by two questions. One was the great question from the Aeneid, like, was it for this? Like, did I live my whole life just to come up to this like crushing blow? Like where does catastrophe begin? Where is its first grain? And the only thing that really provided any relief for me from that question was thinking it was the Big Bang, like all the way back at the beginning of the universe. The Big Bang happens, and all of the molecules go flying outwards and create time as they move, and all of those particles moved outwards and outwards and forwards and came into this moment. That was the only kind of like blameless story I could tell myself. So I guess I became more interested in both cause and effect, and the like harrowing unlatching of cause and effect. And her specific birth effect is an effect for which there is no known cause. They don't know what causes it. So here's this effect that blew my life apart, that blew her own life apart, that had no cause, just effect. It just radically reorients your ideas of plot, of cause and effect, why, motivation. And there are big models in Western culture to help you think about it. Like there are the Greek tragedies, and those fit pretty well. Pettiness of the gods, the habit of reversal, the habit of divine intervention in only like the silliest and most fickle ways, the habit of complaint. So I guess I had some narratives that would then kind of fail me. And then I would patch other ones in. Like, for example, planes, trains, and automobiles, or whatever I had on hand. I patch it in. Or deaths that I went back and thought about obsessively, like River Phoenix's death, his youth and his death outside the Viper Room. He comes again and again. He never talks to me in this book. He just passes by and he dies again and he dies again. He dies again. On a more technical level, I think just the fact that I had this little program for writing where I would start with an icon and write till it was done meant that there was a beginning and an end to every day's writing. And actually, I don't think I ever changed those. I did edit these poems. I don't want to suggest that what's in the book is exactly how it was written. That was not the case. But actually, going from the dedication and the first line to the end, I think is in almost every case how it was conceived, how it arrived, I should say, more than conceived, how it arrived. So I do think that like there was maybe, I haven't had this thought before this moment, but maybe there was a kind of beginning, middle, end, beginning, middle, end, beginning, middle, end that I just made myself write again and again. And maybe with Agony in the Garden, I sort of finally permitted myself to imagine out of that space because that was written as the very last thing I wrote, and while I was well outside the space of the Death Styles.
Well, I wonder if your answer to this question might be also the answer to the one I'm about to ask you too, but I wanted to ask you about the trauma of this material in two ways. One is around time, where you say in the afterword, repetition, I have come to understand, is the shape trauma makes of time. After we lost our daughter, I wanted time to not just stop, but to repeat, even if I couldn't have a different ending. I wanted to have those 13 days with her again. I was caught in a problem impossible to solve. How could I reconcile grief's desire to look backwards and survival's command to move forward in time towards a future where I didn't want to go? And in Toxicon and Arachne, this problem with time is perhaps enacted in the line, the day you were born was the worst day of my life. I'd like to hear more about how you engage with this problem, with time within the art making itself, whether being open to the quote unquote artifacts of the present tense, one of your rules, like the skunk walking through your poem, is part of this. And perhaps also you're interested in the Gothic because of the Gothic being outmoded and not forward looking, that it's, in your words, passionately and fraudulently antique. But I'm also curious what it's like for you to perform this material. I think of Douglas Kearney's incredible essay and performance, I Killed, I Died, Banter, Self-Destruction, and the Poetry Reading, which is this brilliant unpacking of what poetry readings are and the expectation that they be entertaining. But it's also about reading poems about his and his wife's years-long difficulty conceiving a child and the miscarriage they had. Thinking about trauma and what it does to time, I wondered about your relationship to performing this specific material. Is there dread to be overcome? And if so, how do you do that? Is the revisiting of the trauma in performance re-traumatizing and thus creates a need for some sort of ritual before or after the space of performance? Or is something about performing or the style that you bring to performing, I don't want to suggest it as therapeutic, but perhaps possibly temporarily liberating a way through the knot of time, something one might even look forward to enacting because of its effects on you. I think of the lines from Toxicon and Arachne, quote, "I want to text my friend to come to the graveyard with me so she can watch my back while I press my face in the mud in front of my baby's grave. The whole town is flooding and black mudding. I go alone, but I want an audience. But if I cried out, who would hear me among the angelic company?" Talk to us about trauma and time, or trauma and the performance of it.
Yeah, I do think this has changed for me. So when I was reading the poems from Arachne, and that was the new book, I just loved reading them. I just loved reading them because I wanted to spend time with her. I don't want to move on from that moment at all. So I would love to read them. And it was a bit tough. I mean, to figure out how to set that up for an audience. Like I'd read some like real jazzy stuff from Toxicon and be like almost literally a record scratch and be like, and here's this other stuff. But I loved them. I loved reading them. I do, now that you're asking me this, realize that I feel a bit away from that now. I don't feel like I would have that same like access, like I'm using this poem to access that part of my brain that feels in her presence. Instead, reading these depth styles, I actually love to read them for a different reason. Like I love the sound. I love to be the place the sound moves through, and I love to like ride the sinuousness of the sound and the sarabanding of the sound, the assonance, the places where the like short beat lines pick up and pick up and pick up, and when they split again into some kind of assonantal spill. I just love to ride that sound, and I'm glad I wrote, for me, long poems because I want to spend my time in that sound. I suppose there is a little satisfaction too in just standing that naked. In the passage you read before about the seam, like these poems are right at the seam. They're right at the seam of this ambivalence about surviving. Even the V in surviving, the V of survival, it's like you hit the second V, survive, and it's over. You're just gonna have to survive now. That kind of sucks. That long I between the two V's, that's where the poems happen.
Well, could we hear another long poem? I was hoping we could hear Hospital Planners.
Yeah, I'd love to read Hospital Planners. So this is an interesting poem too for the folks in the listenership who care about who are like well versed in poetry, American poetry, because this comes in a run of poems where I was thinking a lot about the visionary poet Hannah Weiner, just her assemblage of kind of sacred items around her, and the need to also get rid of these items to sort of cleanse a space for sacred revelation. It's her I'm talking to in the first few lines, and then from then on, I think it's kind of clear what it's about. This is largely set also at the Children's Hospital at Riley, the James Whitcomb Riley Children's Hospital in Indianapolis, Indiana. So this is the death style for August 25th, 2020, Hospital Planners. I'm sorry you had to throw away the new earthenware cup and all the natural fiber clothes you bought at the men's store on the corner for bearing the taint of men's purple auras, mauveine, synthesized by some undergrad trying to make quinine, and fuchsine, later renamed after the Battle of Magenta, mauvine, fuchsine, magenta. Maybe it will be better. You were never born. I'm sorry you never wore the navy blue singlet we bought to escape from all that baby girl pink. We escaped it all right. Even the cartilage on your ears went bent and rigid as a cartridge. You couldn't bear a secret there, even if you tried. And you tried. I'm sorry for that. Sorry we didn't recognize the perforation of your ankles for the sign it was, despite the nurse's signals. Sorry I got worked up about that sore on your knee and exasperated the nurses. I was afraid it would get infected. Your little knee, you were just a little fat. I'm sorry we didn't take you out to feel the rain on your face before you died or after. Sorry we didn't take you up on the roof or out on the breezeway amid the hospital planters, pale concrete things crowned with improbably fragrant grass, a precious scent, like something from the Song of Solomon, ankle graceful as an ankle strap, kid soul of the comet flashing by, darling. I'm sorry you didn't survive. Reverse all bad. Every time the sun rises, I want to crumple up this whole heliocentric universe. Still, the helicopter rises from its crumpled cup outside the hospital down the hill, and I race out, toting your foster brother to wave at it. Goodbye, goodbye. Come back this time. Knit booties and the eyedropper of a kitten, you revolved in a catball eye till the skin of the water burst, like the film where they shoot the apple and its crown drops into the milk. Thread a little camera into the uterus, watch what beats there. So glad you came and went before all this badness, of which you were the advent. Your name on the parking pass, which for some reason still sticks around, fishing itself back up every so often from the muck in the back of the hatchback, like a bone in the fish's throat, self-cannibalizing fish in love enough with itself to choke on its own bone. A leveret and a loach go out rowing in a nut on Planet Fish in a Japanese song. I ball my hands together and thrust like a parody of prayer or wish just below the sternum and try to dislodge what's lodged at the urging of my digital instructor. I'm renewing my foster license, and just now I want to live in the pyramid on the money inside the eye, inside the park. Look out from that pinhole camera at the sphinxes patrolling the New England graves, not telling their secrets, not giving them up. The hospital planters shake their aromatic heads in the night, in the sodium light. How we petted them, brushed around them like cats, so the scent stuck around in our fur and emanated a third cat as we rounded corners, climbed steps, bathroom, balustrade, embankment, berm, all the locks we had to work get to your birth, like a couple of tomb raiders infiltrating your sacred chamber, converted to devotees thereafter, trying to live in the tomb. Every time we left or returned, we met that oily scent, more amber than lavender, more persistent, more regretful, more distended, more vengeful. Like a cur, the scent recurs, drips from its own jaw, like in the movie called White God. The teen goes pedaling in the street on her way home from orchestra practice. The whole orchestra of curs rises around her in that organized way of the weather seen from space. Bad thoughts and bad news, a nasal rawness, as if someone had mowed down my frontal cortex, carved your name into my brain. Weather and porn feeds loop and revolve. Everything needs to be shaved, made barer, mounted again. The vapidity of mammals, the elegance of a riparian snaking an egg along its length. Your blade spins close, spins away, up and over me. As luckier women stagger the halls held up by balloons. Oh, get me a beret to hold my brain in. The creek gotta rise. In the birth canal, in parking structure, in the retaining wall, in the hospital planter. Let something rise, then let it fall. No censor, no shanker was ever so bereft of your scent.
Listening to Joyelle McSweeney read from Death Styles. So thinking of how you were saying that these poems live in the long eye of the word survival, I wanted to return to questions of prophecy or oracles or of being a seer, and by extension, questions of eyes. The lines from this poem you just read, knit booties and the eyedropper of a kitten you revolved in a cat ball eye till the skin of the water burst are just one of innumerable references to eyes in this book, including I have to jerk my head to one side, I have to slit my eyes, I have to look at it sideways, and to point to the eye to punctuate, and lies half in, half out of the eye, and a huge eye of wheel in the mud in my mind's black eye, and like Keats' indolence ode when he had taken a cricket ball to the eye, and when the image cycles by, it rips my brain out through the eyes, or bust petechia on the eye walls, eye-level cuts in styro, eye in the ham bone, and perhaps most notably, I refuse to shut my eyes because I was robbed of something by a god, and I'm going to keep looking till I find it. These just scratch the surface of your death-style eyes. But you have a chapter in Necropastoral from a decade ago called Eye Wound Media, which also has these lines. To wound the eye is to pluck it from its niche at the top of the humanist hierarchy, seat of vision, insight, understanding, rationality, and reinsert it in a horizontal position of occult and limitless contact. And also, art's evil eye is evil because it never performs perception. It never established stable depth of field that allows the self to construct a mirroring interior depth, thus shoring up the self. This evil eye is instead an aperture through which material contaminates and supersaturates the scene. Art spills from these eyes. So talk to us about eyes and the art spilling out of the eyes and death styles.
Yeah, and I would add one more to your list in the poem I just read, where it says, just now I want to live inside the eye, inside the money, the eye and the pyramid on the money, like on the dollar bill. There's at least two things to say about the eye as emblem in Western culture. One is the idea of the great chain of being, and that the eye is in the head is on the top of the body, the man is on the top of the pyramid of being. This kind of Enlightenment, kind of eugenicist ready model of humanity, and then all the races can also be lined up on that as well. But so this kind of human-centric and sinister way of looking at the world that prizes eyesight. And then two things that are written into that are the idea, sometimes held that there must be a creator because only a creator could have created something as precise and improbable as the human eye. Or on the other side, we didn't need a creator because evolution is what works towards this eye with all these different models of eye spots and places, light registers and bird eye, like in the passage that you read, the bird that moves their whole head to get the 180 view. So all these different models of eyes with their valorization and their models of time, the idea of a creator, the idea of not a creator, the idea of a kind of a maleficent human at the top of all food chains, all of these are kind of written into the eye, which is why the eye for me, I think, is this site, SITE, of so much dubiousness. It is not neutral. It is not a neutral instrument that records and observes and allows us to negotiate Cartesian space. Cartesian space is itself this illusion of rationality, and the idea of sightlines. I'm obsessed with vanishing points as well. Sightlines and vanishing points as fiction. So I guess all these things have to go into why I think of the eye as such an active site, a site where things flow in and out of the eye. It is not just this place where reality is registered and then somehow caught in an image, and instead it's very active at all times. And then we know our eyes are weird fluids, the aqueous humor, that the surface of them is full of germs that we need to have there. I mean, it's so bizarre what the eye actually is. So I think all of these ways to think about the eye make it a very active and fertile site for thinking about humanity in all of our hallucinations and fantasies that we have about ourselves.
Well, I'd like to also spend a little bit of time with you in the underworld or in Hades or hell. Returning to your meditation on the title of the words death and styles together, where you talk about how the two words open a seam through which Persephone falls into the depths of Hades. I also think of how Persephone is one of the rare figures who can travel into the underworld and back out again with the seasons. So she becomes herself a marker of time and also a marker of repetition. And I think of one of your essays about this new book where you say, after the baby died, it was not the case that I could not write. Spring pushed me to a rage. I wrote in counter-torrent, but nothing could make the currents reverse, bring my lost coin back up the drain. So I slammed shut my laptop right there in the dumb cafe. I forbade myself to write. And it feels like you instead follow the lost coin down the drain, exemplified in the line from Toxicon. I summon all mine vanity, virility, and fertility and crash my plane into the abandoned nursery. In one essay, you quote Bolaño when he says, that's what it all comes down to, getting closer to hell or farther away. And you also say, art comes not from on high, but from hell, is not orderly, but counterproductive, that it seeps, that it influences, that it pollutes, contaminates, exhilarates, intoxicates, that it fluctuates, a dubious sublime. And in another place, could the present itself be a mouth of hell, a site, a stoma, a membrane, where absence and presence of the past is painfully mediated? Do we poets stand at the great hole of history, a grave-like pit where the dead can be heard into presence? And similarly, since poetry is, like history, made of paradox, it is an apt and very excellent mode for the poet who can endure it, for entering into hell, for returning from hell, for undoing erasure, for hearing into presence the dead and their inverted because posthumous survival strategies. Such work entails a new kind of history poem, one that does not build up monuments to, rhetorical stances towards, or Cartesian sightlines on the past, but rather exists as a wound, a vexed summonsing, a charged co-bodying. So talk to us about this underworld element, which feels strong in Death Styles. Talk to us a little bit more about hell and writing into the underworld.
Well, one thing I'll say about it is that it's a hell that looks just like this one.
Mm.
You know, it has our weather and our calamities and our failings and our earworms and our media and our broken media and our high school tennis teams. You know, so
Yeah.
it is a hell that doubles for this one, and jostles with this one. Another thing I would say is, and I've been thinking about this a lot lately because in lyric poetry, the signature poet who visits the underworld is, of course, Orpheus. He goes down after Eurydice, but looks behind, and she vanishes, comes up onto the surface, and from there on stumbles about, and then is eventually pulled apart. But the one who pulls off the trick is Demeter, right? The mother, Persephone's mother. She's the one that goes down, and she's a little late. Persephone has already eaten the pomegranate seeds, but she's able to somehow negotiate this deal where Persephone is, up on Earth side, as they say, 6 months of the year, and the underground 6 months of the year. I feel like obviously this wasn't true in ancient culture where Ceres and Demeter were chief goddesses, but I think she's left out of the story of poetry. Orpheus is the person who stands for poets and his lyre, but the Demeter is the one who pulled it off. I've been thinking about that lately as as they say, mid-career poet. A mother of teenagers and a 5-year-old and somebody with some living under my belt at this point. Why the figure of Demeter is just a non-story to us, and what it took for her to do this. She was not a human, so to say she came back up doesn't seem quite right, but she also lived to tell the tale, so to speak.
Yeah.
all the coming and going, the transiting, the duration of it all, the endurance, the fact that it's debilitating, all those things seem built into the story for Demeter, although that's not usually. I've never read a version that has those qualities, but when I think about Demeter, I think about those things, all to get her girl back up on Earth again for even half the time, and that was okay half the time.
Hmm.
And our whole world, our whole climate, everything we understand about an abundant and fructifying Earth, that mythology is like tied to this rescue mission.
Yeah. Well, thinking of this question of hearing into presence the dead and their inverted survival strategies and this idea of a poem that exists as a wound, I wanted to move from the eye to the ear. I've gravitated to your essays about your hearing loss with a particular interest because it's the site of my wounds, is my ears. And for a long time, I wrote directly about this or only about this in many ways. But even now, I find when I'm writing about something else entirely, it often can still become about ears. You also return outside of your poetry to ears and hearing often. For instance, in your essay, Hearing in Hell, you look at Kim Hae-soon's essay called On Hearing, on how her performer of the abandoned sojourns into the underworld to become a medium for poetry and for the dead, the unheard. You call her book a prosthesis for hearing these voices, a hearing aid. And in another essay called Silence at Darien, you say, per my audiogram, I'm only moderately hearing impaired, yet I have lost the contours of conversation, whole registers of volume, tone, and pitch, dire alerts, friendly asides, and quiet confidences. The experience is decidedly benthic. I feel I'm alone at the bottom of the sea. The silence in my ears feels full and fluid, a total regime. Like old telephones in a landfill, my audial nerves ring and ring. The ringing feels wiry, tinsely, and communicative, like my nerves are firing of their own accord rather than relaying a signal. After years of being mediums, now they are trying to tell me something of their own. I lean into the private sound. I close my eyes. I picture the canals of my ears, the broken hairs like broken reeds that refuse to carry godly or mortal sound, the silent fosses and plata of the brain. Above me, the little seams where the skull plates fused in infancy, a fused sky, this enclosed and interior landscape like classical models of the underworld, its meadows, rivers, and fields, its locked hydraulics. I picture every channel so stilled, so locked with fluid that no noise can travel there. The reeds are broken, all the little hairs, and yet it does sound, this silence, a stopped clock that includes all the times and all the crimes, all the mortal sins and venalities, which are after all adjacent. It is saturated with fatality, and I am forever listening, forever listing through its signs. And finally, in a piece you wrote for the Johns Hopkins Medical Center called The Rose of Sound, you say, this is when I experienced a breakage between biological hearing and sound. And then later, I sense that if I am to find a writing practice that can exist in this new zone of grief and trauma, I must rededicate myself to sound. Under the influences of sound, I will call up the sum of my influences, and I will be a place of confluence. I will haunt the dead landscapes of my ear canals, which mimic in form both the dead zones of anthropocentric destruction and the classical rivers of the dead. I will stand in the rush of sound. So I guess my question is, whereas eyes are explicitly all over your poetry, ears are less obviously so. But I get the sense that ears are a big part of your poems. And I'm wondering if they are, how they are.
Yeah, I think that sound is the total terrain of these poems. And I think that's one of the reasons why I do love to read them, regardless of the content, is because, again, like to be in the presence of that sound is just incredible. I'm just incredibly drawn to it. And I think that it is a fluid sense of sound. There's a lot of fluid imagery in the passages that you just read. And I think this idea of sound arriving and moving through me to form the poems, and then I get to experience that again when I read them, and the sound moves through the poems and through my voice and vocal apparatus and all that. I'm just incredibly drawn to it, like a dog to scent. That's how I feel about sound. Like I'm just incredibly drawn to it. I want to bury my snout in it. So I do think it's the total terrain of these poems. And I do think that losing a good deal of my biological hearing, the nature of my hearing loss is I can there are sounds and pitches I can't hear, but often I hear the sound, but I can't pick out the words. Now I have these extremely expensive hearing aids. So now I'm much better off. So I have the sounds, and then my brain shapes them into words at a little bit of a delay. And in that interval is a great mystery to me. And it's kind of where I want to dwell. And it's where I feel like the poems are coming from and where they're going.
Can you articulate, or do you have a sense of how, with the hearing loss, your relationship to the sounds of your syntax have changed?
I started losing my hearing in my late 20s. So growing into myself as a poet and losing my hearing kind of happened at the same time. So I think that this idea of leaning into the mystery of sound, but also to the eventfulness of sound, recognizing that there's temporality built into sound, which we know even from like high school science, that sound is slower than light, right? There's an interval in sound. There's a unsteadiness in sound. There's a mystery in sound that is detectable even to humans with our dumb ears. And in that interval is possibility and mystery, and maybe the decoupling of cause and effect, and maybe the world will end or start again in that little break in the sound. And the time it takes the sound to come across the football field, that was always the example in high school. So to speak even more technically, sound became an event even in the process of having one sound evaluated and being in the audiology booth and sitting there, and the audiologist is sort of behind in a light booth and you're in the dark, and she plays tones and you're supposed to raise your hand when you hear a tone. And so you get into this rhythm of sound being there, sound not being there. Sometimes I was in a situation in those hearing tests where my brain kind of knew there was sound there, but it wasn't turning it into sound in my ear. So I wasn't sure whether to raise my hand or not. Like on some level, I knew a sound was being played, but my brain was not choosing to play it back as a tone. So all of those issues of like all of these gaps and delays and mistakes and echoes and earworms and tinnitus and all the special effects of sound, just like a ravishing theater. And a ravishing alternative cosmos, really, where eventfulness was everything. And then in performance, I really lean into the sonics of my performance for that reason, to make it feel hopefully as captivating to a listener as it is to me. The event of sound, like coming into the space that we're sharing, in this case, a digital space, and both naming an instant, the instant of that sound, and then to feel it elapse together, which is kind of crushing too.
You made me think of, or remember, like my own sense of grief in the audiogram testing studio, when you think that there should be a sound and you don't hear it, like, or you wonder whether there's this sound and it's happened and you didn't register it. But I also love that delay you're talking about between sight and sound, how our brains actually hold the information we get from our eyes until the sound arrives and then synchronizes them together. So that there's actually a lot of manipulation of so-called reality that's happening before we have a perception.
Absolutely. Also in hearing tests, for the hearing test crowd out there, the audiologist reads the set of words that you have to say back, and it is the most improbable set of words. Like, and so you're just hearing this vocab list cycle, and your brain is like trying to sort out what she could be saying, and it has a kind of ritual feeling to it that is so suspenseful. Almost ritual, like in the spiritual sense too, like the god might come into the room if the words are set in the right order. So yeah, it's a ravishing experience and full of grief, tragic and absurd.
Well, could we hear the final poem of the death styles section, conclusive death style, catabasis for River Phoenix?
Yeah, this probably gets at a lot of the images we've been talking about today. including the strange way that this book comes out of and drains back into River Phoenix. It's all about, the book itself is all about rivers, the rivers of the dead, and the rivers here in the St. Joseph River here in South Bend, and now the name River. Okay, so this is the conclusive death style, and it's a catabasis for River Phoenix. I am speaking now of the tower, scoliotic, sclerotic, over streets that slanted steeply like a sick enlisting ship. How it flagged like a flower, it could still point to a star and suck dye up its vasculature. Like any school kid knows how to fashion a crude siphon from a tube, a tank, a parked car, and of course, your mouth. Meanwhile, you go down with hemophilia, and the guards switch sides till we're all down in the basement watching a movie on a sheet. And this movie is a two-reeler, and it's kind of a two-hander, and it's kind of a tear-jerker, and it's kind of the production of a serious sentimentalist, and it's starring two stars, one light, one dark, and the blue expanse is just a tacky backdrop compared with these two, and you're the light one. You're the star who left the light on all night and burnt out. Your pompadour rises as if from a bomb test, alarmed and expansive, knocking it all out. There's not a lot of thinking here. There's not a lot of light. There's not a lot going on. I'd prefer to lie and die outside the Viper room with all my friends suspended on the shockwave as on the red and black walls of Greek vessels, or burst petechiae in the eye walls as on TV the victim strangles. Oh, shut up. Well, anyway, any picture is possible. Any urn at all. And it's not particularly sweet to remember how you tapped your ash, how you knocked your cherry off, how I wanted to leap off the bridge with you, but lost my contact lens in the grass. It was such expensive plastic. I had to drive home with one eye open, and behind me, the other, that perfect lens in the grass, the eye that God made for me so I could image his face and yours as you ashed your Marlboro there. You ashed it from the train bridge, the drifting of a god, the drifting of gold in a river, whenever after the river was dragged by divers, you only turned up later elsewhere. You only turned up your face. River, I'm trying to see around you to an idea of art that's both pit and tower, dick and uterus at once. Inside, the blood can splash, replenish, and shed all over again. Hiss, heat, and daylight invert to a flock of bats, fly back and hang close, irritatingly loyal. Isn't consciousness like that, though? I'd love to slough off the lining of thought from the wall where bats scuff like school shoes, and about that big. And there's plenty here. Plenty of nothingness, plenty of height, and plenty of lowliness, and plenty of dark. Plenty of no odors but our own, and nothing but the furs we wore in life, derealizing into odor, our sight lines sharpening in our skulls that look on nothing, our vision admittedly and at last improved. River, to you I can say, I refuse to shut my eyes because I was robbed of something by a god, and I'm going to keep looking till I find it.
Been listening to Joyelle McSweeney read from Death Styles. So thinking of you saying earlier, quote, under the influences of sound, I will call up the sum of my influences, and I will be a place of confluence. I want to talk about influences, but before we do, we have two questions for you that hinted in that direction. The first is from one of your influences, Dolores Dorantes,
Oh dear.
who wrote the book Style or Estilo that you cite as an influence, a book that Valeria Luiselli called a compact, epic elegy about violence against women that Valeria considers, without a doubt, one of the best books of poetry written in this century. Dolores has since published with Wave Books, translated by Robin Myers, the book Copy. And she has a super quick question for you. So here's Dolores.
Okay.
Do your academic studies influence your creative writing?
Well, how flattering, first of all, to even have a tiny amount of Dolores Durante's time. I mean, La Maestra, amazing. This poem is completely amazing, and everyone should look to find a copy of it. It's out from Kenning Editions in the English in the bilingual translation, and it's incredible. A real guide to posthumous existence with a touch of vengeance thrown in. I will just say that I am one of these people that is always reading, always greedy for more, always learning, always thinking about things, always trying to put two things next to each other and see what kind of light they cast on each other, so that totally improbable confluences can come about. Like in the poem I just read, like the movie My Own Private Idaho, the fact of River Phoenix's beauty, an experience I had as a teenager where all my friends were going to do something super dangerous that we were all really worked up to do, jump off this bridge. And I did lose a contact lens back in the day when contact lenses were expensive. And I don't even know where that memory came from. It just came back as I was writing. I guess it was a moment of like youth and risk and sacrifice and beauty and all of that. Expense. And my contact lenses also were like dyed blue, so I could find them. My eyes are definitely not blue. And so they look like a little firmament. They look like a little map of the universe, like a little orrery or like medieval model of the universe. So I think that confluence for me, and also there's like a story there in that poem. There's like a little bit of the Romanovs and stuff like that. And even a little bit of Yeats, I realized, to start with. I'm speaking now of the Tower in a sort of supercilious way, but also a serious way. Like, I'm going to make a comment now about how I think the cosmos is shaped, and I have a right to do it. And I think maybe it's the schoolgirl in me, to go to Dolores's quote. She might have been very incisive there with that question, because I did make a big study of Yeats, both at Harvard and of Oxford, and he is everywhere in my thinking. But I didn't just sort of start writing about a tower. The first line of his poem had to say, I am speaking now of the tower. So all these decades later, it's I am. This is my tower poem. This is where I map the universe from as a poet mage. So in some ways, I think I will never stop being the like precocious school child, because that is just so part of who I am. But also, I think I also seize hold of all that learning in maybe some unexpected ways.
Yeah, I think you do. Well, our second question is from past Between the Covers guest Douglas Kearney, who was on the show for his book Show, which since Douglas and I talked, went on to win the International Griffin Poetry Prize. And I'll also point people to your essay, Nobody Here But Us Ghosts, which is about the book we talked about and also his live record, part of which we play during the conversation between Douglas and I. So here's a question for you from Douglas Kearney.
Hey there, Joyelle. It's Douglas Kearney, contacting you from the middle of the night in St. Paul, Minnesota. First, congratulations on Death Styles. I just love your work. And one of the things that I love about it, actually, is how much you push yourself, your work, and the reader beyond what we expect our capacities, or the capacities of the work, or the capacity of the writer might be. In praise of Death Styles, Edgar Garcia says that your mantic ear reminds us that the Baroque is not an aesthetic of bewilderment so much as it is a reckoning with those conditions of lost authority, endangered offerings, the sovereignty of exception, and the debts of death that bewilder our searches for the ancient dawn. My question for you is, what lies beyond authority. Thank you.
Well, it's amazing, first of all, to be in the presence of a radio broadcast from Douglas Kearney himself, the cosmic and eternal FM broadcast. And it's always coming from the middle of the night, coming at you live from the middle of the night. And I think what is after authority is the relief from authority, the posthumousity, collectivity, and what can't be predicted. It would be such a relief to lie down in that space and to go photosynthetic, to be like phytoplankton, grave fauna, grave flora, just to break down. I think that's a model for the future that we don't know everything about, and that is its saving grace.
I love that. Well, staying with influences, not just the influences of the artifacts of the present tense from your three constraints, or Dolores's curiosity about how your academic life influences your poetry, but other influences. I first want to read a couple of things you say about influence from Necropastoral. I'm for thinking of influence in terms of the dead metaphors of flow, flux, fluidity, and fluctuation, saturation, and suppuration inherent in the term influence itself. Influence as total inundation with art, inundation with a fluctuating, oscillating, unbearable, sublime, inconsistent, and forceful fluid. And then later, I'm talking of art's influence, art itself, inhuman, non-humanist, which flows toxically through media, through images, yes, through the works of specific artists, that engenders clones, contamination, and anachronism as retroactive and special effects, unearned effects, trick lighting, trick shots, hosts ghost conversations, repeats itself, beware, beware, doppelgangs up upon. I find it so liberating to be free of linear time, of linear literary genres, of forward thinking, of progress, founders and heirs, and instead enter into a variegated zone of alteration, mutation, change, generation, replication, which draws little distinction among me, my body, my laptop, my output, my outfit, my input. Output is just a chance for me to counterfeit or imitate or amplify my input, albeit with dolled up mutagenic effects. So thinking of this variegated zone of influence, I know this book takes its title from an unfinished trilogy that Ingeborg Bachmann's Melina was supposed to be a part of. And within Melina, the main character is writing a book called Death Styles as well. When I think of Rachel Kushner's meditation on this book in the New Yorker, and I think she wrote the introduction for the reissue of this book,
yes,
where she says, the narrative voice, first person and female, is concerned with what she calls today, a word, quote, only suicides ought to be allowed to use. It has no meaning for other people, unquote. Today is time as emergency, a present overtaken by what elsewhere she calls a virus, by which I suspect she means what someone else might call love or being in love, if by saying love they meant a condition that suddenly renders a person incomplete. And later Rachel says, she talks about a hobo in Paris who was given a shower that spiritually undid him. No one should be made clean, she says, for a new life that does not exist. So Rachel's take on the book definitely makes me think of your work. And your afterword has shout outs to many other people, from Alice Notley to Mary Shelley. So talk to us about explicit literary influences on Death Styles, whether that be Melina or Notley or Shelley or other people.
I mean, with the Melina, it was a real contact high from the phrase Death Styles, which, as is mentioned, the book's called Melina. You can see the word Death Styles, like as you work through the front matter and the back matter, but then you can see it in the book as the book that the protagonist, you don't even see it. You see it written on papers that she leaves lying around, on drafts lying around, that her lover then reads and is like, why are you writing this? Something this depressing. So there's all this kind of like concentric circles to find the Death Styles. Like it's kind of fabulous that way. But it was just the phrase therefore death styles, and thinking about like, well, what does this mean within the like regime of control and pressing back against control that I feel like is at stake in Bachman's work. And for me, that regime was survival. It was like this requirement to survive, this requirement to heal, this requirement to go on. I didn't really want to do all those things, or at least I felt extremely ambivalent, with that big V again, and ambivalent about doing them. But I have other children, living children, and responsibilities. And, you know, I'm going to stay on the planet. So that means I'm surviving. So that means I had to invent the style to survive in. So the phrase death styles gave me the kind of invitation to do it. I didn't necessarily realize I was doing this at the time, but when I look back on the work, I realized that I had all of these models, and Bernadette Myers, chief among them, Kim Il-sung's autobiography of death, Mary Shelley's journals, just these models of like dailiness and survival that, like, on the one hand seemed mundane, but on the other hand seemed superhuman. And they did seem to be almost exclusively women writers as well. Not all mothers, but all women writers, or not all mothers whose children had survived, for that matter. So I guess that is how I would connect it to the formally to those influences. And then I think phrase by phrase, like I said, it's a total grab bag between, you know, the sort of named influences, like River Phoenix or the Skunk or whomever it may be, and then the incidental ones, like like I was saying, like John Candy or Some Little Jingle or the Hospital Planters, which is just like an aroma, a memory of an aroma was the style of that. Hannah Weiner and her clairvoyant journals, they keep coming up. And even like, yeah, with Alice Notley, like the syntagmatic, the kind of piece by piece-ness of her work, and especially of Valette as the model of a female, as she calls it, feminine catabasis. So yeah, those were the styles, those were the gestures of, and also I would add to that, like the idea of style, like mourning style, mourning, like mourning dress, and the idea, like the elaborate and the extravagance of mourning dress for women, like across cultures, is one of the, like the most extravagant, aside from wedding, or even more than wedding dress, because you wear your wedding dress for a day, but you can wear mourning dress for a year or ever, forever. So this like this amazing dispensation and this amazing requirement of style that is placed on women is not seen as frivolous when it's related to mourning. So that mourning is like this luxury, excess, battalion display. It's not based on mating. It's anti-mating. It's not based on reproduction. It's anti-reproductive, extravagant, black, made of fabrics. It's woman's work. You take up a shit ton of space. So those are my influences.
Oh, that's great. Well, to invert this question, you and Johannes both push back against notions of taste and tastefulness, of economy, of mastery, and more in your criticism. Talk to us more about the poetries that you identify yourself over and against, or the biases baked into the discourse you most refuse.
Well, I mean, any angel is terrifying and any poetry is interesting. So it doesn't really have to do with the poetry, but with making some fucking room to talk about poetry as something that moves through poems and through poets and across bodies of work and across languages, across communities, across impalpable likenesses, opening up those spaces. So the rhetoric of, you know, reading the individual poem for everything you can find out about it, and then like doing the most virtuosic reading of it, and then that's a specimen of somehow of greatness, like on the person who crafted it. That is just so cosseting for me. Although I do read with great attention in my criticism, and I do like very close line readings, but I'm driven, I think, to connect the works that I read to always be moving outwards and to always be following poetry's path. And the biggest possible models are the ones that I'm after.
Well, thinking of influence, I wanted to ask you about voice, persona, and identity. You quote in Necropastoral Omi Baba saying, "The mask does not conceal an authenticity, but insists on a doubleness." And in your meditation on the Palestinian writer Hussein Barghouti's book, The Blue Light, you quote a passage translated by Fadi Judah that goes, I will pile mask after mask on my face. Under all of those masks, I will ascend naked to the blue light, naked and alone. And from a distance, I will know in my heart for sure that other birds are headed to the same ascension, birds that I will greet from afar as I kill every sorrow inside me that breaks my soul and complains of the journey's loneliness, and I will dance. Give me, please, what? Another mask, a sixth mask. So thinking about a mask as not a concealment of self, but an insistence on doubleness, I think of the way you yourself seek out doubles. In your essay, A Shocking December Red, you engage with the death of a child in the movie Don't Look Now, of which you say about the death in its early moments of the film. And the only solution is to be a solution, to dissolve, to go down the drain, rise on the gorge of the eye of the drain. And you also meditate on the Nick Cave album recorded after the death of his 15-year-old son. And even in your essay that came out last week, looking at the work of Alice Notley called On Being Warlike, speaking of the death of her brother 50 years ago, you say, the pain and loss of her brother is the instantiating event in Notley's career in all of its rage, generosity, and dazzling range. So these various doubles you seek out and then double yourself makes me curious about your notion of voice and persona and even selfhood as you write about a very personal and particular ongoing wound in your own life, but also one that you connect with all these other ones at the same time.
Well, I just strongly conceive of myself as a site that sound comes to and goes out from, and that poetry comes to and goes out from, and maybe pain comes to and goes out from, calamity, catastrophe. I have thought to myself, thinking about these two books, like, are these very like concerned with my own individual story, and like, are they individualistic? And I think they are frank about their location, like they're frank about all their influences. I'm always extremely like frank with myself about my Americanness, my American ear, my mid-Atlantic American accent, my fluency in American violence, my role in American empire, my site as a place American violence goes away and comes back to, all of those things. But I don't think of myself as expressing myself so much as being this like site where things arrive and go out again. I'm saturating and draining, saturating and desaturating, or calling out in transit as the sun goes. And that's how I think about how I fit into this model.
Well, I feel like we should talk about the last long poem, which is a short section called The Agony in the Garden, dedicated to your son, but also a section that shares the title with a famous 15th century painting. As we've already alluded to, it's a radical departure from the rest of the book in terms of form. So I was wondering maybe you could spend a moment and talk to us about some of the considerations and circumstances or the variegated zone from which The Agony in the Garden comes into being, or how and why you change into this mode. Is it in conversation with the painting? And if so, how? And then maybe you could just pick an excerpt of your choosing that we could hear this different mode in which you're a site for poetry in Death Styles.
Well, I will say this is a circular poem. So I was saying before that first I saw this tweet, raw sewage runs down from Coney Island Creek, and there was something about the fluidity and the bumptiousness of that felt like such a classic line of lyric poetry. And yet it's an anti-garden, right? Like raw sewage runs down to Coney Island Creek. This is the opposite of what should be happening in our garden of poetry. It's the opposite of the contract, the contents of Coney Island, the contents of sewage, all that's wrong. And yet it might as well be like Sweet Tem Run Softly, like it's got the move, but it's the wrong content. And I was just obsessed with that. And it kept turning over in my mind as I did sort of sit up with a baby, with our little son. I couldn't say exactly why it ended up accruing in Agony in the Garden, except there's something about that phrase, agony in the garden, that it almost like unwrites itself, the N's and the G's and the A's. So you also have this kind of circular phrase there, just in the sound, in the sonics, agony in the garden, where it's like, it stops and starts itself again and again and again. This kind of circular sound, this kind of circular action of flowing and draining, being collected and starting again. This circular model of time, as opposed to time that's something that begins and ends, which is something that I have been so stuck in for years and years. So I think that is maybe how I'm like connecting this moment. That's how I was connecting these very unlike things, this tweet and this Renaissance painting, which shows Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane. It's after the Last Supper, but before he's arrested, and he's praying in the garden, in the Olive Garden, as it were. And he tells his apostles to stay up and watch his back while he prays for God to like let him out of the contract, and they don't. They go to sleep, and it's like a famous convention in Renaissance painting, these sleeping humans while something incredibly cosmic is going on in the background. The humans are just kind of clumped up to sleep. Okay, yeah, just read a couple different things. The secret lies in Coney Island Creek. You'll learn the true cost when the bill arrives. Congratulations on your destruction, you with your mouth full of sand and samphire stuck in the ruts of your teeth. Crash blows from the mouth of the cave. Smoking wore a hole there in the lapel of the rose, her mouth slipping open, her robe a mouth for ghosts, girth of snow unloosed from its storehouse. The snowplow keeps coming by, lowering its tusks, waking the baby up. Well, let it, why don't you? It's still a union job. This blender has no dimmer, only off on. I learned scripture from the bleachers, peering into my debts on a TV above a bar in Pennsylvania. For Mantegna loved mankind enough to paint them at the most awkward angles and let them still look pretty hot, fixed like a punk's bangs and egg tempera, so much attention, lavinged in such strange directions. Who nuzzled the muzzle? Who set a rooster's egg rolling down the slot of a bad day? Who hobbled by on trotters the day you learn the name of all the beasts? Wind comes tumbling down the hole. Wind winds back into it. On windy nights, the reception goes out. In the middle of the game, static supplies the crowd's sound. Raw sewage runs down to Coney Island Creek. Snow spikes the football, pelts the earth with love. I greet you from the middle of a shitty relationship, or maybe slightly nearer to the end, though I am looking good through the hole in your foot, up at the dog of you laid out on the bed. Like the dog I am, a dog at the deposition. I scatter my notes on a galax that has more iron E than just is. The hand that falls open or closes in sleep is a SARS tumbrel. A rooster's egg loaded with spores, a tumbling hair in the mare's nest galaxy, an omen and a prodigy brought low now to earth. Now release her, cartwheeling across the sky, an electrified cat on a billboard bestride the sideshow with her black tail on fire and her claws in the muck. Let curl from her mouth, a curl of light from a locket, booster rocket or shot in the thighs. Shoot it up and let it fall back in the sky. Go thick and viscid down dark channels where light has gone when it's gone all night. As wind is in the wire, baby's watching TV. Raw sewage runs down to Coney Island Creek.
Been listening to Joyelle McSweeney read from Death Styles. As a way to end, I want to start with where we began, not with a question, but with the joy of reading your language. So this is a passage I particularly love from Necropastoral, from a section called Bug Time, that might be might be a provocative thought to leave people with. Quote, I think so-called progressives and innovators need to think carefully about how their ideologies of experimentation, innovation, newness, progress, and improvement remap or offer support to these ideologies of capitalist, corporate, historical, patrilineal time. The true experimenters, it seems to me, are the bugs that fail, that die 6 times a summer, 450 times in a normal human life, that are mutant and non-durable, that are the repositories of anthropogenic forces, the mutations, the hyperdeath, the evolution and failed evolution of these bodies. Write an anti-history, a non-history of failed adaptation and spectral, miraculous, non-functional mutation, something winking and winged, chirping and failing in the dark. Thanks for being on the show, Joyelle.
I have really cherished this time speaking and discovering things about my own poems and hearing such kind things from people I respect so much, including your dear self, David. Thank you for this time.
Yeah. We've been listening to Joyelle McSweeney reading from her latest book from Nightboat, Death Styles. You've been listening to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's program is recorded at the volunteer-powered, non-commercial, listener-sponsored, full-strength, makeshift home office of me, David Naiman. You can find more of Joyelle McSweeney's work at joyellemcsweeney.com. For the bonus audio, Joyelle contributes a nearly 20-minute video performance from her libretto, Pistorius Rex, which joins supplemental material from everyone from C.A. Conrad to Douglas Kearney to Banu Kapil. The bonus audio is only one possible benefit of joining the Between the Covers community as a listener supporter. Every supporter can join our brainstorm of future guests, and every listener supporter receives the supplementary resources with each conversation of things I discovered while preparing, things referenced during it, and places to explore once you're done listening. Additionally, there are a variety of other potential gifts and rewards, including the Tin House Early Readership subscription, getting 12 books over the course of a year, months before they're available to the general public, to a bundle of books selected by me and sent to you. You can find out more at patreon.com/betweenthecovers. Or if you prefer a one-time donation, you can do so by PayPal at tinhouse.com/support. I'd like to thank the Tin House team, Elizabeth DeMeo and Elisa Ogie in the book division, Beth Steidel in the art department, Becky Kramer and Jay Nichelle in publicity, and Lance Cleland, the director of the summer and winter Tin House Writers Workshops. Finally, I'd like to thank past Between the Covers guest, poet, musician, composer, performer, and much more, Alicia Jo Rabins, for making the intro and the outro for the show. You can find out more about her work, her writing, her music, her film at aliciajo.com, ALICIAJO.com.
you.